The silence of the mountains is rarely broken by words. It's a language of its own, spoken in the creak of a saddle, the hiss of the wind through the pines, and the low murmur of a creek over stones. A man's voice, when it comes, is usually a gruff command to a horse or a curse at a stubborn fence line. So when a whisper cuts through that silence, you listen. It carries a different kind of weight, a gravity that can pin you to the spot. And sometimes it can change everything. The air was so dry it felt like it was sucking the moisture right out of my bones, a familiar, relentless thirst that was a part of life out here. My horse, a stubborn bay mare named Poco, snorted, her breath puffing into a small cloud of dust as we crested a ridge. Below us, the valley sprawled like a rumpled, sun-bleached blanket, the grass a faded gold, the river a silver thread barely visible in the distance. Another day, another stretch of land to check. I'd been a rancher in these parts for 15 years, and a lifetime before that, I'd learned to read the land. But it wasn't the land that had my heart pounding against my ribs today. It was the woman sitting on the porch of a weathered, abandoned line shack. She was a small thing, a stark shape against the sun-bleached wood, a ghost in the harsh light. Her name was Clara, and she was a newcomer, a city woman who'd inherited her uncle's property, a rocky, useless patch of land adjacent to mine. In the 2 months since she'd arrived, I'd barely exchanged a dozen words with her. She was like a wild creature, quick to flinch, quicker to retreat into the shadows of her own silence. The men at the general store in town whispered about her, their voices thick with unkind amusement. "Plumb scared of her own shadow," they'd say. "Won't look you in the eye." They made up stories, the kind of mean, idle chatter that fills the void of small-town life. They said she was a spinster, a recluse, touched in the head. I'd never joined in, but I'd never defended her either. To be honest, she was an enigma I didn't have the time or the energy to figure out. Today, something was different. I'd ridden over to talk to her about the fence line that bordered both our properties. The section that ran along the canyon's edge had been broken for a week, and my cattle had strayed onto her land 3 times. It was a practical matter. I dismounted, tied Poco to a gnarled juniper, and walked towards her porch. As I got closer, I could see her hands were clenching and unclenching in her lap, a nervous, almost frantic motion that spoke of a deep, quiet turmoil. She was staring out across the valley, but her gaze was vacant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the horizon. The tin cup on the railing next to her was filled with something dark, long gone cold. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. She was talking to herself again, a habit I'd noticed before. It was unsettling, the way she seemed to be in a world of her own, a world that was clearly not a happy one. "Clara," I said, keeping my voice low. I'd learned early on that a loud voice made her jump like a startled deer. She didn't react at first. "Clara," I said again, a little louder. She flinched, her whole body stiffening, and she slowly turned her head. Her eyes, a faded, watery blue, were wide with a startled, almost childlike fear. She stared at me for a long moment, her gaze flickering between my face and the hands at my sides, like she was assessing a potential threat. I gave her a small, what I hoped was a disarming smile. "I'm sorry to bother you. It's about the fence line again. A few of my steers got through." She blinked, the fear slowly fading to be replaced by a familiar blank mask of anxiety. Her voice, when it came, was a tiny, hoarse whisper. "Oh," she said. "Yes, the fence." "I'll fix it tomorrow," I said, but it was a hollow promise. I'd said the same thing 3 times before. The stretch of fence was treacherous, hugging the edge of a 50-foot drop. It was a job I'd been dreading. "But for now, I'd appreciate it if you could if you see any of my cattle, could you just shoo them back through the gap? I don't want them to get spooked and fall into the canyon." She nodded, a jerky, quick motion. "Of course, I can do that." She said the words, but the effort to get them out was palpable. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands now twisting the hem of her faded calico dress. She was a study in tension, a creature made of wires pulled too tight. It was a struggle for her to even hold a simple conversation. I felt a pang of something close to pity, but it was mixed with frustration. She was an inconvenience, a problem I had to manage. I was about to turn away to leave her to her silent, solitary world when the situation took a sudden, sharp turn. A sound, a low, rumbling cough echoed from the valley below. It was followed by a crash and the frantic, bleating cry of a sheep. We both whipped our heads around. Down on the slope 100 yards away, a massive, dark shape was thrashing in the brush. It was a grizzly, a monster of a bear, easily 600 pounds. It had a sheep in its grasp, the animal's white wool stark against the beast's dark fur. It was Clara's sheep, from the small, pathetic flock she'd been trying to keep. I heard a sharp, choked gasp from beside me. "Oh no," she breathed, the two words a fragile, almost silent exhalation. The sound was one of pure, unadulterated horror. "Stay here," I said, my voice sharp with a command I didn't feel. I didn't have my rifle. It was back on my saddle 100 yards away. I was a rancher, not a bear hunter. I carried a Smith & Wesson revolver on my hip, a 5-shooter that was more for show and for scaring off coyotes than for stopping a grizzly. A bullet from it would only make the beast angry. The bear dropped the dead sheep and turned its head, its small, malevolent eyes scanning the slope. It was assessing us, weighing its options. It had a kill, but we were a potential threat or an easier meal. I could see the raw, primal power in its massive frame, the hump of muscle on its shoulders, the thick, matted fur. It took a slow, deliberate step towards us. "Clara, get inside. Now," I hissed, not taking my eyes off the bear. I slowly, carefully began to back up, my hand resting on the butt of my revolver. But she didn't move. She was frozen, as if her feet had taken root in the porch. I could see the fine tremor that ran through her entire body, a barely perceptible shaking. Her face had gone bone white. She looked like a porcelain doll about to shatter. This was more than just fear. It was a complete, utter paralysis, a drowning in her own terror. "Move," I yelled, the sharpness in my voice finally cutting through the fog. But instead of retreating, she did the opposite. She took a single, shaky step forward to the edge of the porch. She was watching the bear with a disturbing intensity. Her hands were now balled into fists at her sides. "He's just hungry," she whispered, her voice so faint I almost didn't hear it. It was a strange, disconnected observation, as if she were narrating something that was happening on a distant screen. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to herself, like she always did. I stared at her, my mind racing. She was terrified, but she wasn't running. There was something else in her eyes now beyond the fear. A deep, ancient sadness, a bone-weary exhaustion that seemed to have no end. I saw the recognition in her gaze. The sheep was dead. It was a loss. But it was the way she was looking at the bear, with a sort of bleak understanding, that made my blood run cold. It was as if she saw a kindred spirit in the monster, a creature also driven by an ugly, desperate hunger. The bear had taken a life, and in her eyes I saw the reflection of something that had taken life from her, a different but equally devastating kind of monster. Then the bear dropped its head, let out a grunt, and began to drag the dead sheep away into the brush. In seconds it was gone, leaving behind only the rustle of leaves and the scent of blood in the air. The silence that followed was more deafening than the roar. I let out a long, shaky breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. My hand was slick with sweat on my revolver. I turned to look at Clara. She was still standing at the edge of the porch, her hands at her sides. The fear was still there, a tremble in her lip, a glint of unshed tears in her eyes. But now there was a new emotion in the mix. Something that looked like shame, a deep and profound humiliation, as if she'd just revealed a part of herself she'd never wanted anyone to see. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a mere thread of sound. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. He took one of my sheep." "It's not your fault," I said, but the words felt empty and weak. A cheap platitude to a woman who just faced down a monster and looked at it like it was an old friend. "You shouldn't have been out here." I walked back to my horse, my mind reeling. I was angry, but not at her. I was angry at myself, for my own cowardice, for my own inability to do anything, for the way I'd seen the truth of her in that single, terrifying moment. This wasn't a shy, eccentric woman. This was someone who had been through a war of the soul, and had come out the other side irrevocably scarred. She had faced something worse than a grizzly. It was in the way her hands shook, in the way her eyes were always searching for a threat that wasn't there, in the way she whispered to herself, a constant, silent argument with a demon I couldn't see. I mounted Poco and gave Clara one last look. She was still standing on the porch, a fragile silhouette against the fatting sun. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the scrubby, empty land where the bear had vanished, her face an unreadable mask of pain and resignation. The men in town were wrong. She wasn't just quiet. She was a fortress, a woman who had built walls so high that even the shadows couldn't find a way in. The image of her standing there, frozen with that look of desolate understanding, burned itself into my memory. I kicked my horse into a trot and rode for home, the shadow of the mountain closing in around me, a whisper of a question already forming in my mind. Who was she really? And what in the world was it that she had faced that had left her so utterly, completely broken? I didn't sleep much that night. The image of Clara standing on her porch, looking at that bear as if she recognized a part of herself in its primal, destructive hunger, was seared onto the back of my eyelids. It wasn't just the grizzly. There was something else there, a ghost of a story that hung around her like a shroud. I spent the next few days fixated on the fence line, an excuse to be near her land to see if I could catch another glimpse of her, to try and decipher the puzzle she presented. The fence itself was a nightmare. The old posts were rotten, the barbed wire rusted and sagging. But the real barrier, the one I was trying to chip away at with a single, stubborn thought, was the wall she had built around herself. I saw her a few times, always at a distance. She'd be in her small, overgrown garden trying to coax life out of the stubborn, rocky soil. She moved with a cautious, almost apologetic grace, as if afraid of disturbing the earth itself. I saw her once at the creek, filling a bucket, her head snapping up at the slightest sound like a frightened animal at a watering hole. Each time I'd get the urge to ride over, to say something, to bridge the yawning chasm of silence between us. But I held back. After what I'd seen, I knew any clumsy approach would only send her burrowing deeper into her shell. She needed to come to me. Or maybe she didn't need anything from me at all. Maybe my curiosity was just a selfish intrusion. The awkward silence had stretched into a week. The day was dying, the sun bleeding orange and red across the sky, when I was mending the fence at the far edge of my property, the section nearest to the canyon. I'd finally brought the right supplies, new, sturdy posts, fresh rolls of barbed wire, my heavy work gloves. It was a hell of a job in the fading light, but I was determined to finish it. That's when I saw her again. She was walking along the canyon's edge, a path I knew well. It was a dangerous, precarious trail, one I'd warned my own hired hands to avoid. It was a shortcut, but one wrong step, a loose stone, and it was a 50-foot tumble onto the rocks below. I stopped hammering and watched her. She was a lone figure, her long, dark skirt brushing against the dry brush. She was walking slowly, deliberately, her head down. There was a purpose to her stride that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the hesitant shuffle of a scared woman. It was the steady gait of someone who was lost in a memory. She stopped at the edge, a few feet from the sheer drop, and looked out over the valley. The wind, a constant presence, was tugging at the loose strands of her hair, whipping them across her face. She didn't seem to notice. Then for a long, heart-stopping moment, I saw her lean forward just a fraction, her shoulders slumping. It was a gesture of such profound despair, of such utter exhaustion, that it sent a jolt of fear through me. My hammer fell from my hand, clattering against a rock. The sound was sharp and loud. She jerked upright, spinning around, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes were wide, not with the usual fear of a stranger, but with a different kind of alarm. She'd been caught. I was intruding on something deeply private. I felt like a voyeur. "Clara," I called out, my voice rough with the effort of trying to sound calm. "It's me, Jack Hayes. I'm just fixing the fence." She didn't answer. She just stood there, her hand still pressed against her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I could see the guilt in her eyes, a deep, sinking shame at being caught in such a vulnerable moment. She looked trapped, a rabbit frozen in the glare of a lantern. "It's getting dark," I said, my voice softer now. "That trail's not safe. Why don't you come up here? The ground's more level." She hesitated for a moment, and for a second I thought she was going to run. But then slowly, she turned and started walking back along the canyon's rim, taking the longer, safer route back to the fence line. She kept her distance, stopping about 10 feet from me, as if there were an invisible boundary she wasn't willing to cross. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I waited, picking up my hammer and setting it back on the post. "I'm sorry if I scared you," I said. "The hammer just slipped." She shook her head, a quick, jerky motion. "No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be out here." Her voice was a thread barely there. "It's your land," I said. "You can go where you please." She flinched as if I'd struck her. It was the wrong thing to say. I'd accidentally reinforced the fact that this was her world and I was just a trespasser. I needed to change the subject, to make it less about her and her walking and more about the mundane, the safe. I gestured to the fence I was fixing. "Looks like I've finally got this old thing fixed. Should keep the cattle out." She gave a small, absent nod, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her foot was tracing a small, nervous pattern in the dirt. She was wearing a thin, worn shawl that did little to keep out the cold. I could see a fine tremor in her shoulders. I was about to say something foolish like, "Are you cold?" when she spoke again, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "The bear," she said. "You think he'll come back?" I was surprised. She was making conversation. More than that, she was asking about something that had clearly terrified her. "He might. They're creatures of habit. He'll probably follow the creek for a while, but he's had his fill. He might not be back for a few weeks." She nodded, her eyes finally lifting to meet mine for a fleeting second before dropping again. There was a new question in her eyes, a flicker of something desperate. Then she took a ragged breath and the words came, tumbling out in a quiet, disjointed rush, as if she were making a confession. "I have dreams," she started, her gaze fixed on the rocks at her feet. "They're not nice dreams. I wake up and I feel like I'm still drowning. It's been years and I still feel like I can't breathe." I didn't say anything. I didn't dare. It was like she was a dam that had suddenly cracked, and I was terrified that any word from me would make her slam the breach shut again. Her whole body was trembling now, a palpable, visible wave of distress. "They called it a tragedy," she continued, her voice a barely audible whisper. "A sad, tragic accident, they put it in the papers. Tragic loss for promising young couple, something like that. They even misspelled my name." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped her lips, a sound that was more painful to hear than her sobs would have been. "But it wasn't an accident, it was a choice. I chose to go with him that day. I chose to get into his car. I chose to let him drive." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The pieces were falling into place, a terrible jigsaw of grief and guilt. She had been in a car accident, a bad one. She hadn't been in a fight with a bear. She had been in a fight with the ghosts of the past, and she was losing. "He was just tired," she went on, her voice trembling with a naked pain she had clearly been holding in for a very long time. "We'd been arguing, stupid things, things that don't matter. And then the truck just came over the hill. He swerved. I should have screamed. I should have told him to slow down, but I didn't. I was just so angry. And then everything was dark and loud, and there was glass everywhere." A single tear escaped, tracing a clean line through the dust on her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. "He was the one who was quiet," she said. "I was always the talker, but after I didn't have any words left. All my words were for him. The doctors kept asking me if I was all right. My family, they kept saying I was lucky to be alive. Lucky." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and bitter with irony. How could I be lucky when he was dead? He was the one who was quiet. He was the only one who ever really listened. Her story hung in the air, a fragile, terrible echo of a grief that had ossified into a way of life. The silence that fell between us was different from the awkward, tense silences of the past. It was a shared silence, a thick, communal space where her words could settle. I could feel the weight of her confession, the sheer effort it must have taken to push those words out into the open. She was not just a shy woman. She was a survivor, carrying a terrible burden of guilt and loss, a weight that had slowly, inexorably been crushing the life out of her. "You were in the mountains," I said, finally finding my voice. It was a statement, not a question. "The silence was supposed to help," she admitted, a new note of hopelessness creeping into her tone. "They said the quiet would be good for me, but the quiet, it just makes it louder. I can hear him. I can hear him telling me it wasn't my fault, but I know the truth. I was the one driving him to the airport. I was the one arguing with him, if I had just been quiet like I am now." "It wasn't your fault," I said, repeating the words she had just quoted from her own ghosts. The words sounded clumsy and inadequate, a cliché from a cheap novel, but I meant them with every fiber of my being. She looked at me then, and for the first time I saw something other than fear and shame in her eyes. It was a flicker of confusion, of desperate, foolish hope. She didn't believe me. How could she? She had been telling herself the opposite for years. But in that moment, as the final sliver of sun disappeared behind the mountains, she wanted to believe it. "The man in town, Mr. Dawson at the general store," I said, changing the subject, trying to give her something solid to anchor herself to. "He says you don't speak. He says you're a ghost. He's wrong, Clara. You just spoke to me. You told me your story. That's not a ghost. That's the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." Her lips parted, and for a moment I thought she might smile. She didn't, but the faintest glimmer of something, was it hope, flickered in her eyes. She nodded slowly, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She wrapped her thin shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The conversation was over. She had given me everything she had. Now she had to retreat back into her own silence to process it. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice still barely above a whisper but no longer trembling. It was steadier, more certain, for listening. She turned and walked away, back towards her little shack. I watched her go, her silhouette becoming one with the encroaching darkness. Her words had unlocked something inside me, too. The way she had blamed herself for a split-second decision, for an argument, for simply being there. It held a mirror up to my own life, my own quiet, unspoken regrets. I felt a strange kinship with her then, a bond forged in the crucible of shared human fragility. She was a testament to a kind of pain I had never fully understood, and in her confession she had given me a gift, the truth, raw and unvarnished. It was a whisper from the mountain, and it had left me, for the first time in my life, utterly, heartbreakingly speechless. The weeks that followed were a slow, tentative dance. I didn't push. I'd learned my lesson with the bear. Clara wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a wound that needed time to heal. I gave her space, but I also made a point to be a consistent, quiet presence on the edge of her world. I'd leave a pile of firewood by her doorstep, neatly stacked, never saying a word. I'd mend a loose board on her corral, a small, anonymous act. I saw her watching me from her window, a faint, fleeting shape in the glass, and I'd just tip my hat and get back to work. The silence between us was no longer an awkward void. It was a garden, and I was slowly planting seeds of trust. And then something else arrived. It wasn't a person, but a force of nature. The sky turned an ugly, bruised shade of purple, and a wind, hot and dry as a dragon's breath, began to howl down from the peaks. It was the kind of wind that precedes a wildfire, and my heart sank. I'd lived through enough of them to know the signs. The air itself felt like it was made of fine, abrasive sand. The entire valley was a tinderbox just waiting for a spark. That spark came 2 days later. A lightning strike, miles away, near the base of the mountain, started a small fire. But the wind was a traitor, fanning the small flames into a ravenous, hungry beast that raced across the dry grass. We didn't have a fire department. We had neighbors. We had ourselves. I had a team of men, but the fire was moving fast, faster than a man could run. It was coming straight for the valley, and the line of trees that bordered our properties were a conduit of fuel. I organized a crew of men from town, men who were more than willing to help, but the situation was desperate. We had shovels, picks, and a few buckets. We tried to create a fire break, a line of bare earth where the fire would have nothing to burn. But the heat was fierce, and the fire just laughed at our feeble efforts, leaping over the patches of dirt we cleared as if they weren't even there. I was digging frantically, my hands blistering, my lungs burning with the ash-filled air when I saw Clara. She had appeared at the edge of the chaos, a small, pale figure in the smoky haze. She wasn't wearing her shawl. Her sleeves were rolled up and she was carrying a canteen. She looked terrified, a rabbit in the headlights of an oncoming freight train, but she also looked determined. For a moment I thought she was going to run. I could see the battle in her eyes, the instinct to flee warring with a new, fragile resolve. Her fear was a tangible thing, a physical presence, but she wasn't frozen like before. She was taking deliberate, measured breaths, her lips moving silently. She was talking to herself again, but it was different. It looked like a mantra, a quiet incantation against the panic. Then she did something I didn't expect. She started walking along the edge of the fire break, calling out to the men. Her voice was still quiet, a mere whisper against the roar of the flames, but it was clear and surprisingly steady. "There, the line is thin there," she yelled, pointing to a spot where the fire was licking at a cluster of dry brush. "We need to dig there." A few of the men glanced at her, their faces smudged with soot and grime. They were surprised, and I could see the skepticism in their eyes. She was the ghost, the town recluse, but I knew better. I saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, a sharp focus that cut through the panic. She was seeing the terrain not as a chaotic blaze, but as a map. She was looking for the fire's weaknesses. "She's right," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Dig there now." The men, taking orders from a stranger, hesitated only for a moment. Then they turned their shovels to the spot she'd pointed out. I could see she was trembling, a fine tremor that ran through her entire body, but her eyes were fixed on the fire, and her jaw was set with a grim, unwavering determination. The collective fear and exhaustion of the men was palpable, a tangible presence in the smoky air. But Clara's unexpected arrival, her small, defiant voice cutting through the chaos, had injected a new energy into the fight. She wasn't just standing there. She began to work. She grabbed a shovel from a man who had collapsed, exhausted, and started digging alongside the others. She was small and the shovel was heavy, but she worked with a stubborn, desperate strength. I saw her hands, which were already red and blistered from her work in the garden, being torn by the rough wooden handle. She didn't stop. She never even slowed down. She was a whirlwind of motion, a tiny, fierce engine of survival. Then a fresh horror. A gust of wind, a monstrous belch from the sky, sent a wall of flames roaring up the ridge, a fiery explosion that cut off the two men on the farthest edge of the fire break. They were trapped, their path to safety severed by a river of fire. They stood there, silhouettes against the inferno, their faces masks of pure terror. I heard one of them scream, a high, keening wail of despair. Everything seemed to slow down. I saw the fire leap, a hungry orange tongue reaching for them. I saw the men turn and start to run, but there was nowhere to go. My heart seized in my chest. There was no time. I could only watch, a frozen witness to the horror. And then I saw Clara move. She didn't even hesitate. She grabbed a fire blanket from a pile of supplies, a heavy, ugly thing made of woven asbestos. She darted towards the trapped men, a small figure running headfirst into the heart of the inferno. I opened my mouth to scream her name to stop her, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the flames. She reached the men just as the fire was closing in. She threw the blanket over one of them, a clumsy, desperate motion, and pushed him towards a narrow gap in the flames. The other man stumbled, and Clara grabbed his arm. She was pulling him, dragging him, her slight body straining against the weight of a man twice her size. The fire was so close I could feel its heat, smell the burning of her hair, the wool of her dress. I was running towards them, but I felt like I was moving through molasses. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I saw the man she was dragging fall to his knees. I saw her crouch over him, shielding him with her own body, a human shield against the fire. The blanket had fallen and the flames licked at her back. I heard a scream, and it was her voice, a sound of pure agony. Then I was there. I grabbed the man, hauling him to his feet. Another man, a cowboy named Pete, grabbed Clara, swinging her away from the flames. We stumbled out of the inferno, a ragged, singed group of survivors, collapsing onto the bare, scorched earth. The fire for a moment seemed to be retreating. The wind had shifted, pushing it back towards the mountain, giving us a brief, desperate reprieve. My ears were ringing. The air was thick with smoke. I looked for Clara. She was on her knees, her back to me. Her dress was torn, and I could see a patch of angry, red skin on her shoulder where the fire had kissed her. Her hands were bleeding, and she was shaking violently, her whole body racked with heaving, silent sobs. I knelt down beside her. She was gasping for breath, tears carving trails through the grime on her face. She was alive. That was the only thing that mattered. I put my hand on her shoulder. She flinched at the touch, and I pulled my hand away, afraid of hurting her more. "Clara," I said, my voice a ragged rasp. "Look at me, you're all right, you did it. You saved them." She turned her head, and her eyes, red-rimmed and swimming with tears, met mine. The terror was there, raw and unflinching, but so was a fierce, defiant pride. The walls she had built around herself, the walls of guilt and silence, had been burned away by the fire. She had looked death in the eye and had dared to not only survive but to fight back. She had pulled 2 men from the jaws of the inferno, a feat of pure, unadulterated courage. In that moment, the shy woman was gone. In her place was a survivor, a warrior who had finally remembered who she was. The ghosts of her past, the guilt of the car accident, the endless, agonizing whispers of self-blame, they had been silenced, at least for now, by the sheer, undeniable roar of the present. The fire had been the catalyst, the crucible that had forged her anew. She was still trembling, still crying, still utterly, profoundly shaken. But she was no longer broken. She was whole. The fire had finally been beaten back, a surrendered beast retreating to the barren slopes of the mountain. The valley was a wasteland of ash and sorrow, a lunar landscape where nothing green remained. It had been 2 weeks, and the air still smelled of smoke, a persistent, acrid reminder of the danger we had faced. The town of Dry Creek had banded together to rebuild, a collective act of defiance against the ruin. Logs were cut, the first stones were laid, and the slow, painstaking process of recovery had begun. I had thrown myself into the work, the physical labor a balm for the chaos in my mind. But my thoughts always drifted back to Clara. She had become a legend in the valley. The story of the shy, silent woman who had run into a fire to save 2 men had spread like, well, wildfire. The men she saved, a couple of ranch hands named Bill and Hank, were visibly shaken whenever they spoke of her. They couldn't quite believe it, and neither could anyone else. I would hear people in town whispering her name, but the tone had changed. It was no longer laced with condescension or cruel amusement. It was now a hushed, respectful reverence. She was still the recluse, the one who didn't speak, but now the silence was seen as a badge of honor, a mystery, not a weakness. I saw her a few times during the cleanup. She had helped too in her own quiet way. I'd see her bringing water to the exhausted men or collecting the singed debris, her hands wrapped in clean, white bandages. She was still timid, still flinched at loud noises, but there was a new steadiness to her. The fire hadn't just burned the land, it had burned away a part of her fear. She had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed, and it had fundamentally changed her. But the whisper of guilt, the ghost of the accident, still lingered in the shadows behind her eyes. And then one afternoon I found her at the very spot where I had first truly seen her, the edge of the canyon looking out over the blackened valley. The wind was just a gentle breeze, a far cry from the howling monster of the fire. She was wearing a new dress, a simple dark blue calico, and her hair was tied back with a piece of leather. She looked different, not just physically, but in the way she held herself. Her shoulders were no longer permanently hunched in apology. They were square, her chin lifted. "Clara," I said as I approached. I didn't want to startle her. I didn't think I could. She turned and I saw it. A real smile. A small, tentative thing, but it was there, the first I had ever seen on her face. Her eyes weren't just watery blue, they sparkled with a new light. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice was still soft, but it wasn't a frightened whisper. It was a calm, clear, quiet tone. She was no longer apologizing for her very existence. I stood beside her, looking out over the valley with her. The silence was comfortable. It was no longer a barrier. It was a shared space. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment, "about the fire, about what happened." "I think about it a lot too," I admitted. "It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen." She nodded. "It was, but it wasn't the most terrifying thing I've ever lived through." She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. "That was the day I walked into the mountains. The day I left everything I knew behind and came here to live alone in the quiet. I thought I was running away from the pain, but I was just running into a bigger silence." She looked down at her bandaged hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "I hated myself for so long, for surviving, for not being able to save him, for arguing with him, for just being there. I thought I was a coward for wanting to live. And the silence, the endless, empty silence, it just made it worse. I was drowning in it." "You're not a coward, Clara," I said, the words coming out with a force that surprised me. "The day you faced the bear, you didn't run. And the day of the fire, you ran in. That's not a coward. That's the bravest woman I've ever known." She looked up at me, her eyes glistening. "It wasn't bravery, Mr. Hayes. It was desperation. I didn't want to watch anyone else die. I couldn't. I finally realized that I had been dying by inches, by years of silence. And watching those men, seeing them trapped, it was like watching myself drown all over again. I couldn't let that happen. I had to do something. Anything." "You did more than anything," I said. "You saved them. And I think in a way you saved yourself." She was quiet for a long moment, contemplating my words. The breeze carried a faint, faint smell of rain. The clouds were gathering in the west, a sign that the long drought might finally be over. "I want to tell him, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "My husband, not in a letter, not in a prayer. I want to stand over his grave and I want to tell him that I forgive him. And I want to tell him that I forgive myself. For not being able to save him, for being angry, for everything." I felt a lump form in my throat. "That sounds like a good thing to do, Clara." "It's a long way to go," she said. "I don't have a horse and I don't have the money for a train, but I have to go. It's the only way I can truly move on." "Then I'll take you," I said, the words coming out before I could even think them. "I'll get Poco saddled in the morning. It's a few days' ride, but we can do it." Her eyes widened. "You would do that for me?" I shrugged, feeling a little foolish. "I have to see this through, Clara. I saw you on the porch, saw you face that bear, saw you walk into that fire. I'm not just a rancher watching from a distance anymore. I can't go back to that. I need to see you make peace with yourself. I need to know that someone can do it." She smiled again, and this time it was less tentative. It was a full, beautiful smile, a sunrise after a long, dark night. "Thank you, Jack," she said. It was the first time she'd used my first name. It sounded good. It sounded like a promise. The next morning we rode out. It was a hard trip, but a good one. The land was beginning to heal, tiny shoots of green appearing amidst the blackened earth. It was a symbol, a testament to the resilience of life. We talked more. She told me about her husband, Daniel, a quiet man who had been a school teacher. She told me about the little town where they had lived, a place I'd never heard of. And as she spoke, I saw the shadows in her eyes begin to fade. We found the grave, a simple headstone in a small, weed-choked cemetery. I hung back, giving her space. She knelt in front of the stone and I saw her talking, her lips moving in a silent whisper. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the tears streaming down her face. It wasn't the tears of despair I had seen before. These were tears of release, of absolution. She stayed there for a long time, the wind whispering through the dry grass. The mountain had been her sanctuary of silence, but this was the true destination. Her journey had finally brought her here. When she finally stood up and walked back towards me, her face was dry. She looked lighter, as if she had laid down a heavy burden. "He's at peace," she said, her voice a steady, quiet calm. "And I think I am too." We rode in silence for a while, through the golden light of the afternoon. The land was opening up, the dark, burned patches giving way to the first, tentative signs of new growth. It was a quiet, shared space, a profound understanding between two people who had both been touched by tragedy. "What will you do now?" I asked, as we crested a hill and saw her valley spread out before us. She paused, looking out at the world with new eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice full of a quiet wonder. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan, I don't have a script. I have possibility. It's terrifying." She laughed, a soft, clear sound. "But it's also exciting." We continued to ride, side by side. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. I was acutely aware of her presence beside me, of the journey we had taken together. We were no longer just neighbors. We were partners in survival, connected by a shared experience that had fundamentally changed us both. The story of the shy woman who had walked into the fire was a story of redemption, of finding a voice in the midst of silence. It was a reminder that even the most broken of us, the ones who whisper to the ghosts of their past, can find the strength to roar. I looked at her, the setting sun illuminating her face, and I knew that she had finally found her voice. And it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The stillness of the mountains wasn't a whisper of death anymore. It was a prayer of new life, a quiet, hopeful prayer for a future that was finally, mercifully, her own.